He is 76 years old, and he still runs across a stage like a man trying to outrun something. For 3 hours at a time, guitar slung low, sweat soaking through his shirt, Bruce Springsteen gives audiences the version of himself they came for. The boss, indestructible, larger than the decades that have passed since Born to Run made him famous. But underneath that performance is a life that has been quietly, relentlessly hard. A father whose mind slowly broke apart without ever being named. A son who inherited more than a guitar and a work ethic. A band that lost its brothers one by one. A wife who kept a life-threatening secret so the world could keep believing in the myth. This is the story most people watching him sprint across a stadium floor tonight will never hear. This is what it actually cost to become Bruce Springsteen. Long before there were arenas, there was a small, cramped house on South Street in Freehold, New Jersey, where a boy learned to read a room before he learned to read music. His father, Douglas Springsteen, moved through a string of jobs, factory work, driving a bus, whatever paid that month, and struggled with drinking that nobody in the family had the language to properly explain. It would be decades before Douglas was finally diagnosed with schizophrenia and clinical depression. A diagnosis that arrived far too late to undo the years that came before it. For most of Bruce's childhood, what the family lived with wasn't called an illness. It was called mood, a temper, a bad night. Springsteen has spoken about sitting at the kitchen table across from his father in the dark, watching him drink for hours in total silence, never knowing if the night would end quietly or explode. That kind of uncertainty does something to a child's nervous system. Bruce developed nervous tics young enough that kids at school gave him a nickname for it. A small, almost comic detail that says everything about how much a child can absorb simply by trying to survive inside four walls. What makes it heavier is that this wasn't new to the family. Springsteen has talked about mental illness running through his father's side for generations before Douglas ever carried it. Relatives who battled the same darkness with no name for it, no treatment, no framework at all. His grandmother, who helped raise him, has been described by Bruce himself as intense and overwhelming in her own way. One more unstable presence in a household that offered very little steady ground. He was the oldest child, so he absorbed the brunt of it first, long before his younger siblings understood what they were even living inside. And there's a particular kind of grief that shows up only once you're an adult. The moment you realize the chaos of your childhood was never actually about you. Springsteen has said in interviews given decades later that he wishes his father could have gotten real help far sooner, that an actual diagnosis and actual treatment might have changed both of their lives. Instead, Douglas spent his working years undiagnosed, and Bruce spent his childhood trying to make sense of a storm nobody would name. By the time he was a teenager, the tension at home had become close to unbearable. When Bruce was 19, his parents packed up and moved across the country to California, chasing the hope that new surroundings might ease what he later called the blackness in his father's mind. It didn't fully work, but it gave Bruce something he needed badly: distance, and with it, room to start becoming someone separate from his father's shadow. For a stretch of those years, he didn't have a permanent address at all, sleeping on whatever couch or floor was offered. While he chased a music career almost nobody around him took seriously yet. None of that fits the glossy version of the American rock and roll story that casual fans picture. But it's impossible to separate his songs about factory towns and broken families from the actual home that shaped him. Before there was a stage, there was a kid trying to survive a house he couldn't control, and that instinct to survive never really left him. Fame is supposed to fix things like that. It didn't. In his 2016 memoir, Born to Run, Springsteen revealed publicly for the first time that he had spent years in treatment for clinical depression, a confession that stunned longtime fans who had spent decades watching him perform as the picture of stability and grit. He wrote about episodes severe enough to leave him unable to function, including one breakdown in his 60s that he later said may have warranted hospitalization, even though he never actually checked himself in. When asked how long that particular episode lasted, he admitted he genuinely couldn't say. Weeks, maybe longer, because depression has a way of warping even the sufferer's own sense of time passing. Coming from a man who had spent a career embodying American toughness, that kind of honesty reshaped how an entire generation of fans understood him. Springsteen has said the fear underneath all of it was never just the depression itself. It was the terror of becoming his father, of sliding, without warning, into the same untreated darkness that had defined his childhood. He didn't know the shape or the limits of his own illness, didn't know how far down it could take him. That fear is what eventually pushed him toward therapy and medication, long before it was common for public figures to talk about mental health treatment this openly. His wife, Patty Salfa, has played an outsized role in managing those low periods over the years. By his own account, she became the person who could spot the earliest signs of a downturn and gently steer him toward help before things spiraled. It's a strikingly ordinary picture hiding behind an extraordinary public image. A spouse quietly making sure medication gets taken and appointments get kept, tour after tour, year after year, while the world outside sees only the sprint across the stage and the guitar thrown into the crowd. That contrast is part of what makes his story land so hard. Audiences watched him deliver 3-hour shows loaded with physical intensity, seemingly powered by something bottomless, while privately he was managing an illness that can make simply getting out of bed feel impossible. Springsteen himself has suggested that the manic energy of his live performances might be tied directly to the same insecurity that fuels his depression, a nightly need to prove he was still enough for the people in front of him. Long before Patty became his anchor, his first marriage told a very different story. He married actress Julianne Phillips in 1985, at the absolute height of his Born in the USA fame, and the marriage ended in divorce just 4 years later, a period he has since acknowledged coincided with real emotional turmoil as he tried to reconcile massive public success with private instability. It would take years, and a relationship built gradually inside the E Street Band itself with Patty, before he found a partner who understood both the music and the man underneath it. Talking about all of this publicly didn't cure anything, but it gave millions of fans permission to recognize the same struggle in themselves without shame, and that alone reframes his legacy, not simply as a chronicler of other people's hardship, but as a man who lived a version of that same heartbreak long after the spotlight found him. Even as he made a kind of peace with his own mind, the world kept taking pieces of the family he had built around himself, starting with the band that had stood beside him from the very beginning. If Bruce Springsteen ever built a second family, it was inside the E Street Band, the group of musicians who backed him through 5 decades of records and tours. That family has not been spared from tragedy. The first blow came in April 2008, when longtime keyboardist and accordion player Danny Federici died of melanoma at just 58 years old. Federici had been with Springsteen since the earliest days of the band, shaping the sound of song after song with his organ work. His death came in the middle of an ongoing tour, and Springsteen chose to keep performing days later, telling audiences that playing on was the only way he knew how to grieve someone who had shared a stage with him for almost 40 years. Just 3 years after that loss, tragedy struck the band again, this time far harder. Saxophonist Clarence Clemons, known to fans simply as the Big Man, suffered a stroke at his home in Florida in June 2011 and died from complications a week later at 69. Clemons was never just a session player. He was Springsteen's on-stage foil, one of the most recognizable figures in rock history, standing shoulder to shoulder with Bruce on the cover of Born to Run. Their partnership went back to Springsteen's earliest nights playing bars in Asbury Park, long before either of them could have imagined stadiums full of people chanting their songs back at them. Springsteen has described Clemons as far more than a bandmate, a relationship that ran deeper than the music itself. Losing him left a gap the band spent years figuring out how to fill, eventually bringing in Clemons's nephew Jake to help carry the saxophone parts forward, a solution that honored the original bond rather than trying to replace it outright. These weren't distant industry acquaintances. They were men Springsteen had grown up with, argued with, forgiven, and built an entire creative identity beside for the better part of 40 years. Watching them go, first Federici and then Clemons, many kept performing the very songs that once celebrated their shared youth, now doing it as one of the last original members still standing from that founding lineup. And there's an extra layer of ache buried in the timing of it all. Springsteen had actually broken up the original E Street lineup back in 1989, touring with other musicians for close to a decade before reuniting with the classic group in 1999 for one of the most celebrated comebacks in rock history. That means when Federici and then Clemens passed away years later, the band was mourning men they had only recently found their way back to after a painful decade apart, which makes both losses sting with an added layer of regret over lost time that can never be recovered. Grief like that doesn't simply fade once the tour resumes. It lives inside every performance of the songs those men helped create, a quiet reminder that survival, even for the boss, means continuing to sing about people who are no longer there beside him. And as if losing pieces of his musical family wasn't enough, the years since have brought an entirely new set of battles, this time involving his own body and the health of the woman who has stood beside him through all of it. By his 70s, Springsteen had already carried more emotional weight than most performers face in a lifetime. But the physical toll of decades on the road was only just beginning to show. In 2023, while touring with the E Street Band for the first time in 6 years, he was forced to postpone a string of shows after being diagnosed with peptic ulcer disease, a painful condition involving open sores in the stomach lining. What started as a handful of postponed September dates eventually grew into the loss of his remaining shows for the year, as doctors urged him to complete treatment before returning to the stage. For a performer whose entire identity has been built around relentless physical stamina, being sidelined by his own body carried a different kind of heartbreak. A 74-year-old man who once treated 3-hour shows as a nightly ritual, forced to admit, quite publicly, that his body needed rest. He eventually recovered and resumed touring in 2024, but the episode was a clear signal that the physical price of a lifetime on stage had finally arrived. Then came a heartbreak far closer to home. In September 2024, at the premiere of the documentary Road Diary, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Patti Scialfa, revealed that she had been living with multiple myeloma, a rare and serious blood cancer, since being diagnosed back in 2018. She had kept it private for years, quietly stepping back from full touring duty, while fans speculated about her reduced presence on stage, never realizing she was managing a serious illness behind the scenes the entire time. In the documentary, she explained that the disease compromises her immune system, so she has to be careful about where she goes and what she exposes herself to, occasionally joining the band for a song or two on stage as what she called a treat rather than a routine. For a couple who built both their marriage and their band partnership around decades of touring side by side, that shift represented a quiet, private grief neither of them chose to broadcast until they were ready to control the story on their own terms. Weeks later, in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, Springsteen gave fans an update, saying simply that Patti was doing good, even as he acknowledged it was a tough disease to live with. The story, remarkably, has taken a hopeful turn. In August 2026, appearing at Boston's PanMass Challenge, a fundraising bike ride that channels donations directly into cancer research at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Springsteen shared that Patti had reached remission after more than 8 years living with the disease. In a pre-recorded message, he said that Patti had been living with her multiple myeloma for over 8 years, but that, thankfully, she was now in remission. He credited the physicians and nurses who had cared for her throughout, describing medical research not as some abstract budget line, but as something that had personally sat beside his family in its most frightened moments. It was a rare glimpse of pure relief from a man whose public story has so often been shaped by loss, and it landed as a reminder that even after everything, the childhood, the depression, the grief for his bandmates, his own health scare, there are still moments where the outcome breaks in his favor. Taken all together, the ulcer diagnosis that interrupted his own tour and the years-long cancer battle his wife fought